Okay, so I deprehend myself out of unconscious in Donne's Biathanatos and Derrida's Gift of Death. I would like to begin with what Derrida, in his autobiographical work, Circumfession, calls the mise en scène of a suicide. Derrida's narrative tells the story of his mother, Georgette Derrida, dying with her tragic outburst, "I want to kill myself." Derrida responds to this painful moment with a fantasy of his own death. "I have lived in prayer, tears, and imminence at every moment of their survival, terminable survival from which I see myself live," translates, "I see myself die. I see myself dead, cut from you in your memories, that I love, and I weep like my own children at the edge of my grave." Later in Circumfession, Derrida will use an idiom of the French language to express the paradox of seeing himself die while fantasizing at the same moment that he is alive to witness it. Derrida formulates the paradox differently, but with the same effect. "I don't take my life, mais je me donne la mort." Or, "I don't take my life, but I give myself death." Martin Hagelin, in his book Radical Atheism, calls Derrida's resistance to absolute death here the autoimmunity of the desire to live for survival. Little play on the word survie, live on, or to go live over, beyond. Or as he puts it, he has to kill himself in order to live on. I agree with Hagelin that Derrida is saying he has to kill himself in order to live on, but quite contrary to Hagelin's radical atheist purpose, I would argue that Derrida is confessing his guilty conscience. Derrida feels guilty, not because his mother is dying, for having reinvented the concept of conscience as a, quote, non-dogmatic doublet of dogma, or even the possibility of religion without religion, which is to say, religious structures continue to live on in a secular society. We think we're beyond it, but we're not. This reinvented conscience will have the same structure of conscience as the Judeo-Christian faith, but in the new conscience, which I will name the evental conscience. A responsible subject can only make moral decisions by exposing itself to the risk of an event or the arrival of another. I will provisionally use Derrida's definition of autoimmunity as that strange, and I quote, "as that strange behavior where a living being in quasi-suicidal fashion itself works to destroy its own protection, to immunize itself against its own immunity." End of quote. Derrida's caution regarding the living being's destruction in quasi-suicidal fashion means that the autoimmune self need not be actually suicidal, but can be almost suicidal or virtually suicidal, because there are many ways to give oneself death, whether one thinks about it, dreams about it, or writes a treatise about it, as Derrida and Donne have. The paradox of autoimmunity, summed up in the multilingual syntagms, "I don't take my life, mais je me donne la mort," but I give myself death, brings us to John Donne's Biathanatos, not only because of the homonymic use of the word done by Derrida. Done, the present tense of the verb in French, is give in English, and echoes the title, the gift of death, which employs the infinitive form of the verb donner la mort, and can be rendered as either to put to death or to commit suicide. Donne offers a fantasy parallel to Derrida's by giving himself death when he writes, and I quote, "Whenever any affliction assails me, methinks I have the keys of my prison in mine own hand, and no remedy presents itself so soon to my heart as mine own sword." The first of many similarities with Derrida's gift of death. I would even say, at the risk of troubling some Donne scholars, that Biathanatos should be given the title, the gift of death. to capture its principal argument in defense of suicide. And at the time, that was very taboo. I say this since Donne argues, anticipating Freud's concept of the death drive, that we not only have a, quote, natural desire of dying when we would, end of quote, but Donne argues more strongly that it is a necessary duty because he, Christ, laid down his life for us. Therefore, we ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. End of quote. Christ's death is exemplary because it is voluntary. And, quote, all those places in the Scripture which direct us by the example of Christ to do it as he did, show that in cases when our lives must be given, we need not ever attend extrinsic force of others, but as he did in perfect charity. End of quote. Christ's example shows that our lives must be given as an act of perfect charity, an act of love, a benevolent gift to others, or what Derrida is calling a gift of death, in order to prove that the conscience is autoimmune. I will show that all responsibility in Derrida's gift of death depends on a moral decision demanding a personal sacrifice. Indeed, a gift of death. Chapter 3 in the gift of death presents the paradox, or aporia. In every moral decision, that isn't a calculation, a true decision. Through the figure of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, I will add to this well-known analysis with a brief comparison with Derrida's essay, The Force of Law, the Mystical Foundation of Authority. In both texts, Derrida introduces the ordeal of the undecidable, where he contrasts the tension between epoche and rule, or between the suspension of rules and the following of rules, in every decision. The ordeal of the undecidable is the experience of paradox, or aporia, having to choose between following the rules or the law, which is, quote, general responsibility, end quote, while simultaneously suspending those rules. And Derrida then cites Kierkegaard that the single individual is higher than the universal. The singular other is elevated above the law because she is treated like God, who is the wholly other, W-H-O-L-L-Y, so completely other, entirely other. Treating the singular other like God is what Derrida refers to as absolute responsibility. Derrida sums up this paradox of the undecidable with the axiom tout autre et tout autre. Or, I'm not crazy about this translation, but it'll do. Every other one, brackets, is every bit other. Or every other is wholly other. Now that translates in at least two ways that they conflict. Because it makes everybody equal. We're all alike because we're all wholly other. But each other is like God, totally unlike everyone else. Can't avoid that conflict, ever. The undecidability of the decision forces the subject to decide, but only by making a sacrifice of one side in favor of the other. Sacrificing something we love in the decision calls up the contradictory feelings of love and hate. God knew it, I don't want to do it. This ambivalence precipitates a decision like Abraham's to sacrifice his only beloved son Isaac, whom he hates to lose. As Derrida maintains, Kierkegaard uses the sacrifice of Isaac to exemplify all moral decisions. Ultimately, it is because a decision is an instant of madness that one cannot explain or justify a decision that could easily have gone the other way and still could go another way after the decision. The unknowability and unjustifiability of the decision is why Derrida says, quote, the decision is always secret. End quote. To invoke Biathanatos again, the secret of the decision is an important reason that Donne always talks about the secret cases of conscience. But the secret is also the structure of conscience for both Derrida and Donne, since, as Derrida claims, and I quote, God is the name of the possibility I have of keeping a secret that is visible from the interior, but not from the exterior.
It is the secret that Donne and Derrida share that forms the basis of the comparison in moral decisions of the conscience. This essay will therefore be divided into three aspects related to the secret. The first part of the essay will examine the structure of conscience as the key to the autoimmune conscience. And I think Derrida never said those words. I'm putting those words in his mouth. So my life is not going to be very long after today. So autoimmune conscience, since it requires an other as witness to whatever secret that divides the subject, exposing it to the other. The second part will focus on the secret itself and the ways that Donne and Derrida, despite their significant differences, both regard the opacity of the conscience to others and even to oneself as essential to its moral freedom to decide. It's because I don't know what I'm doing that I'm free. Which, by the way, explains a lot of my thinking. The third and last part of my paper will consider Donne's use of the word deprehend, which is an obsolete word now. The only very few people in the 17th century used deprehend, to signify the voice of conscience, dividing the subject from itself, whereby it becomes both subject and object. The word deprehend means, quote, to catch or detect a person in the commission of some evil or secret deed, to take by surprise. That's the alternate. This experience is very close to that. My lecture will discuss how the element of surprise is crucial for the conscience, since it allows the guilty party to discover their own guilt, a discovery that is resisted because we press, deny, and keep secret the truth about ourselves. The word deprehend also opens up to the event of the other, including one's own guilt, since the event is by definition a surprise, always a singular event, unlike any others. As Jean-Luc Nancy states, what makes an event is not only that it happens, but that it surprises. The irony is that autoimmunity, and maybe Mark, right? The irony is that autoimmunity, the quasi-suicidal experience of a living being attacking itself in order to live on, is necessary for the conscience to function effectively. As Derrida remarks, quote, autoimmunity is not an absolute ill or evil. It enables exposure to the other, to what and who comes, which means that it must remain incalculable. Without autoimmunity, or its opposite, with absolute immunity, God could be considered as absolutely immune. Nothing would ever happen or arrive. We would no longer await or expect one another, or expect any event. End of quote. Deprehending oneself, surprising oneself, is perhaps an exemplary example of autoimmunity at work in the conscience. Surprises. One of the clearest statements that Derrida makes regarding autoimmunity and its relation to suicide is in his book, Rogues, on the autoimmunity of democracy. Derrida criticizes traditional philosophical conception of self as autos or ipseity, and the classical conception of freedom for surreptitiously giving the self, and that's what autos and ipseity are, Roman and Greek, giving the self too much mastery, or what he describes as, quote, explanation needs explanation, but the I can of my own freedom, of the freedom that is mine, of the freedom of the I myself, indeed of the voluntary, conscious, intentional deciding I myself. Want to have all the power to decide in you. That's not going to fly. We meet the self-mastering subject everywhere in Donne, but especially in Biathanatos. Donne writes, for example, and I quote, this obligation which our conscience places upon us is of stronger hold and of straighter band than the precept of any superior, whether law or person. End of quote. For Derrida, however, we find that autoimmunity destroys the voluntary subject. And I quote, for what I call the autoimmune consists not only in harming or ruining oneself, indeed in destroying one's own protections, and in doing so oneself, committing suicide or threatening to do so, but more seriously still, and through this, and threatening the I, or the self, the ego, or the autos, itself, compromising the immunity of the autos itself. It consists not only in compromising oneself, but in compromising the self, the autos, and thus obsidian. It consists not only in committing suicide, but in compromising sui, or self-referential, the self, or sui of suicide itself. Autoimmunity is more or less suicidal, but more seriously still, it threatens always to rob itself of its meaning and supposed integrity. End of quote. Autoimmunity, in other words, has destroyed the self or the sui in the word suicide before any decision to commit suicide ever happens. The word suicide, from the Latin reflexive pronoun sui, of oneself, and cide, cutter or killer, in fact, was not even available to Donne in his lifetime. That word was not invented. And it was not a Latin word. As we shall see later, the self must be invented and reinvented with every act and every decision, since with every act and every decision we become other to ourselves. You're not who you are. You are what you want to be. If I may digress for a moment, I should acknowledge that there is a controversy over Derrida's recurring use of the figure of autoimmunity as, quote, the immunizing itself against its own immunity or protecting itself against its own protection. There's a problem in biomedical terms with this figure because the immune cells or antibodies do not simply attack other immune cells. In Derrida's well-known analogy, the body protecting itself against its own protection is meant to illustrate the way the body attacks itself as a kind of immunosuppression of the immune response in order to tolerate an organ transplant or a graft. Your immune system kills it, why do the organ transplant? Why do the skin graft? The disease HIV has the effect of attacking the immune system, but in this case the cause is external, not internal. However, Esther Timar, in her groundbreaking work on the relation of biomedical discourse to Derrida's claims, has discovered an uncanny parallel development between the two in the research of Thomas Pradot in his book Limits of Self, Immunology and Biological Identity in 2012. As Timar puts it, if we want Derrida to be right, which is to say, if we want the immune system to be more open to the other, more tolerant of foreign and domestic antigens, which attack it, we have to adopt Pradot's, quote, new theory of immunogenicity. How do we generate our immune system? Which replaces the old self-non-self binary as fixed and embrace a more flexible model of the immune system as a continuously altered reactivity to antigens associated with allergy. In fact, this continuity theory is made possible by the invention of the word allergy from the Greek allos or other and ergon meaning work or activity. The word allergy, which you could translate as the work of the other. Allergy is the work of the other. Does the allergy ever stop? Ever? You go to another place and you get an allergy you never had before. You're allergic to your new clothes, to your cereal. It doesn't. I mean, I had toothpaste. I became allergic to it. I had to get a new one. Allergy never stops. So your immune system never stays the same. It's always changing, forever. It's a material reaction to a material reality. If you want Derrida to be right, you have to have this new theory of immunogenicity, which replaces the old self-non-self binary as fixed and embrace a more flexible model of the immune system as continuously altered reactivity to antigens associated with allergy. In fact, this continuity theory is made possible by the invention of the word allergy. And the word allergy was invented in 1906 by Clemens de Puquet to account for this continuously changing, altered reactivity of the immune system. As Timar tells us, and I quote, continuity theory, instead of figuring it as developing a shield which can protect an otherwise weak self, it is seen as a process of enmeshment during which the newborn organism opens itself to and incorporates some of its environment. Immune cells can then become more tolerogenic, can tolerate more, can create cells that are more tolerant of the foreign and the internal antigen, because rather than simply reading once and for all, reacting once and for all to a foreign antigen, the organism maintains an ideal of homeostatic average of reactivity. In the case of the microbiome, for example, symbiotic or commensal bacteria are not so much, quote, residents because they are tolerated, as they are tolerated because they are residents. The allergy's already there before you even knew you had it. Timar clarifies further, saying residence compels tolerance, not the other way around. So, allergy never stops, and it's always already part of what Timar is arguing. A point she shares with another important essay by Michelle Jameson, Allergy and Autoimmunity, Rethinking the Normal and the Pathological, is that the self and the non-self are ecologically constituted. Or as Jameson also states, quote, allergy acknowledges the body's openness to deviation as a fundamental expression of its nature, and the organism, this is another statement by her which I found quite beautiful, the organism is a process of worlding. That's at the level of the body. This version of autoimmunity is certainly applicable to the autoimmune conscience, as we shall see. It might be worth mentioning here, as noted that by the editors of Biathanatos, Michael Reddick and M. Pabst Batten, that the word suicide wasn't available. In 1608, the word suicide, a modern neologism and a Neo-Latin reflexive pronoun, did not appear in English until 1642, introduced by Thomas Brown in Religio Medici, followed by Walter Sharp in his work The Ephesian and Chimerian Matron in 1668. Donne uses the term self-homicide most often, or self-murder. The Greek word biathanatos in the title is rendered by Reddick and Batten as bia, or force, and thanatos, meaning death, and which they say is a term for one who succumbs to a violent rather than a natural death. And which they say, quote, is a term for one who succumbs to a violent, one may be tempted by the lure of reflexivity in the word suicide and its synonyms, the way Derrida fears, and I quote, the Socratic know thyself or know yourself, seems to install the philosophical in that same lure of mastery, that I have all the control. The lure of reflexive mastery ignores, quote, the Unheimlichkeit of the Geheimnis, the uncanniness of secrets. The uncanniness of the secret, Derrida uses German here to signify the contribution of Heidegger, particularly in Being in Time, to the historical genealogy of the concept of conscience, with the paradigmatic shift in his analysis of the call of conscience. For Heidegger, as Derrida quoting Heidegger reminds us, quote, the call comes from me, and yet from beyond me, over me. Heidegger's call points to the uncanny otherness of conscience, but Derrida turns from hearing a voice of conscience, which I would suggest you read as ancient phenomenon on Husserl, and that does not belong to the subject's own conscience, to the gaze of God. So he switches to the visual metaphor rather than the oral. Derrida repeats a biblical phrase to represent the disymmetry of the relation between God and the believer as an analogy to self and other. And I quote, But when thou do alms, let not the left hand know what the right hand doeth. Thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father, which seeth in secret, himself shall reward thee openly. End of quote. So why does he go to that inability? One hand doesn't know what the other is doing. The dissymmetry, that is the disproportion, dispossesses the subject's conscience of any mastery. Derrida's interest in the gaze springs from the fact that God is an invisible other who sees without being seen. And I quote a paradoxical concept that also has the structure of a type of secret. It is to this diametrical structure of conscience that we must now turn and look at more closely. If you're having trouble with the dissymmetry, remember that you were named before you were born. And when you die, your name keeps going. And I think both of us say, that's not fair. Right? So you didn't have that control in the beginning, and you didn't have it at the end. So that's like the gaze. You're being watched all the time. The passage below on the structure of conscience is nothing less than Derrida's explanation of the condition that makes responsibility possible. What makes responsibility possible is based on, quote, the condition that the good no longer be a transcendental objective, as it is in Plato, a relation between objective things, but the relation to the other, a response to the other, an experience of personal goodness, and a movement of intention. Now, I was going to analyze this later in the essay, but I didn't. But the long and short of it is that to love someone, and this my students sometimes find very difficult. Okay? You reach out to them and you desire them and you want to be near them. But if you really love them, you have to stop and distract. You have to let the other be. You have to leave the other alone. That's what love is. If you don't believe me, read Dante's Vita Nova. Right? You have to let the other go. Is that a little death in itself? The passage below on the structure of conscience is nothing less than Derrida's explanation of the condition of what makes responsibility possible, and it's contrary to the movement of intention, even though it is an intention. Our relation to the other is not only the condition of responsibility, but it states, reciting Emmanuel Levinas, we must distinguish it from the law for the relation with the other, that is to say, justice will become determinative. God is the name, and I quote, God is the name of the possibility I have of keeping a secret that is visible from the interior but not from the exterior. Once such a structure of conscience exists, of being with oneself, of speaking, that is, of producing inevitable sense, once I have within me, thanks to the invisible word as such, talking to myself, for example, a witness that others cannot see, who is therefore, and this is the important part, at the same time other than me and more intimate with me than myself, once I can have a secret relationship with myself and not tell everything, once there is secrecy and secret witnessing within me, then what I call God exists. There is what I call God in me. It happens that I call myself God, a phrase that is difficult to distinguish from, quote, God calls me. For it is that condition. For it is in that condition that I call myself, or that I am called in secret. God is in me. He is the absolute me, or self. He is that structure of invisible interiority that is called, in Kierkegaard's sense, quote, subjectivity. End quote. Derrida makes the secret an example of the non-coincidence that we have of ourselves, and to make the point more emphatically, he even gives a secret. We share with ourselves the name of God. A secret is structurally unknowable because there is no content hidden that we can learn by uncovering it, but instead, quote, to share a secret is not to know or reveal the secret, it's to share we know not what. Okay? We are all different from each other, and we all share that. That's a secret. You can never know what the difference is. You can try, For example, God is so singular a being that nothing can be affirmed of Elohim, or of hosts, which is a plural, by the way. Especially gender, since that would limit God's infinitude. God is infinite, since God is, quote, beyond being, and therefore immortal, omnipotent, and omniscient. As negative theology would argue, in order to avoid speaking of God directly, in order to avoid speaking of God's unpronounceable name, God's singularity can only be expressed with the nameless name that sustains God's ineffable being. You want to be with God more than anything, then you're supposed to back down and back off. Love. Paradox. As the name of the absolute secret, God serves as the name for possibility I have, of the possibility that I am keeping it a secret even from myself. But paradox, quote, is the structural feature of the secret. According to John Caputo in Prayers and Tears with Jacques Derrida, Religion Without Religion, 1997, quote, the secret is constituted by saying and thinking the secret so that it is both divulged and negated. You give it away and then you take it. And hence divided against itself. Caputo continues, quote, if it were utterly secret, purely secret, if the secret were purely secret, there would be no secret to keep safe. A pure secret, like the pure gift, makes no appearance and has no phenomenality. End of quote. He then quotes Derrida bluntly saying, while posing as a negative theologian, quote, there is no secret as such. Undeniable. Derrida clearly differs from God on the nature of the secret, especially in matters of conscience. On the other hand, we might find them not as far apart as we might think. Jane Kusner, in his fine article, Donne Biathanatos, and the public series Vexing Freedom, has already written about the theme of secrecy. Kusner, in his article, Donne Biathanatos, and the public series Vexing Freedom, has already written about the theme of secrecy shared by Derrida and Donne, but unfortunately, he has not identified the way Derrida defines the secret as we have just done. Kusner does not give the example of Abraham, or he does give the example of Abraham, who must keep secret his desire to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac to avoid the judgment of his wife Sarah, along with the judgment of society and the charge of murder. But perhaps most significantly, he avoids the temptation of ethics itself. Kusner rightly states the decision to sacrifice one's own son or oneself made the relation between God and the conscience, made on the relation between God and conscience, cannot be justified before the human community, because that's the general. Kusner cites the gift of death in a way that usefully highlights the difference between a responsibility to law and society and absolute responsibility to the singular other. Quote, and this is from the gift of death, quoting the gift of death, Abraham kept quiet in order to avoid the moral temptation, which under the pretext of calling him to responsibility, the self-justification, would make him lose his ultimate responsibility along with his singularity, make him lose his unjustifiable secret and absolute responsibility before God. Absolute responsibility is not a responsibility, at least not a general responsibility. In general, it needs to be exceptional and extraordinary. And needs to be that absolutely and par excellence. It is as if absolute responsibility could not be derived from a concept of responsibility, and therefore, in order for it to be what it must be, it must remain inconceivable, indeed unthinkable. It must therefore be irresponsible. So responsibility must be irresponsible in order to be absolutely responsible. There's no language, no reason, no generality or mediation to justify this ultimate responsibility, which leads me to absolute sacrifice. If there is no reason or generality or mediation that can justify Abraham's sacrifice, then the explanation for sacrifice will be kept secret, whether he speaks or not. Abraham would appear to others as an irresponsible madman anyway. Kusner gives an example of how self-homicide may be justified by one's own conscience, because the context appears morally dubious. In Donne, he quotes Romans 3:8, opposing the doctrine attributed to Christians that a man might do evil, that good might come thereof. God may send others to punish us as his instrument if we do evil and effect a good outcome. His agents may be his angels, sometimes the magistrate, sometimes ourselves, to be our own punisher. These agents, ministers, and instruments of his, I'm quoting Donne, are physicians. And we may not refuse any bitterness. No, that which is naturally poisoned being wholesomely by them. It's delivered, that poison is delivered, but it's a good thing. For readers of narrative, this poison that we may not refuse is a pharmacon, both poison and remedy, familiar to us from Plato's pharmacy. The pharmacon is also discussed in Timar's analysis of the relation of allergy as autoimmunity. And of course, every allergy can give you more resistance. So the thing that might kill you might save you. Of course, medicinal poison would be the means of suicide, with Donne's qualification that we may, like a magistrate, judge ourselves. Quote, but because, though the prevention of evil, we may all do the offices of a magistrate or a judge upon ourselves in secret cases, but whether we have that authority to do it after or no, especially in capital matters, is disputable. Cousineau wisely chooses this example because it is another of Donne's secret cases, by which he means a private matter, but also it implies a case where the motive or intention is unclear, making it a matter of individual conscience. Cousineau then quotes a key passage in Biathanatos, without noting in this section that Donne refers to a case in the letters of St. Augustine, where he talks about the freedom of election and conscience. This is as close as Donne gets to Luther's doctrine of the freedom of conscience, which is routinely placed by Luther in opposition to the law of the Ten Commandments. It is nonetheless an important context for the argument of the whole, and is relating with Donne's or Derrida's resistance of the singular individual's conscience to more than just the norms and law of society. And I quote, this is a long way, so that if there be cases wherein one may assuredly, or probably after, just diligence used, conclude upon an illumination of the Spirit of God, or upon ceasing of the reason of that law at that time, the man is sui juris in his own right. He can decide for himself. For though in cases where there is a proper court, I am bound to it, yet as kings, which are both sovereigns, may therefore justly decide a cause by war, because there can be no competent judge between the two kings. So in secret cases, between the Spirit of God and my conscience, of which there is not certainly constituted any exterior judge, we are ourselves sufficient to do the office. We can decide for ourselves. And then, delivered from all bondage and restored to our natural liberty, we are in the same condition as princes, who, if in the right or words they may not properly be said to give themselves privileges, yet one general inherent privilege, and when they will, they may declare that in that particular case, they will not make a new, but use an old privilege. So we can decide for ourselves, as long as we don't invent new rules for doing it. Cousineau comments that Donne's startling analogy between God's Spirit and the individual's conscience are likened to two warring kings where the self and God occupy the same plane. Cousineau asserts that the analogy is unmistakable and is blasphemy. But by placing God on the same plane, we can propose that the plane is inside the court of conscience. Donne has placed God and the believer as equal authorities, but when we find ourselves outside the limits of the law, because the ceasing of the reason of the law at that time in him, I don't believe in the law anymore, Donne claims that that man is in his own right. As we shall see, this is very close to the ordeal of the undecidable. I better get going. The relation of conscience to the law in Donne starts to resemble Derrida's positioning of absolute responsibility against general responsibility. And I quote from Donne. In these exempt cases and privilege cases, the privilege is contra just universality, not against universal law, but against the universality of the law. This is splitting hairs, but it's important. It doth only succor a person, not wound nor infirm the law, no more than I take from the virtue of light and the dignity of the sun, if, to escape its scorching thereof, I allow myself the relief of the shadow. So it's okay to go against the law. You've got to get out of the sun to get some shade. As Ruddick and Pabst point out, the very generality of the law makes privileges necessary, but that legitimate privilege cannot contravene natural law or jus gentium. Okay, so Derrida is now going to talk about what a fresh judgment is. And Donne has come so close to that position hundreds of years in advance. And remember, Donne did not publish Biathanatos until he died. He told, he gave others to keep it secret, but not to burn it, not to print it. And this is Derrida on a fresh judgment. In short, for a decision to be just and responsible, it must, in its proper moment, if there is one, be both regulated and without regulation. It must preserve the law and also destroy or suspend it enough to have to reinvent it in each case, re-justify it, reinvent it, at least in the reaffirmation of a new and free confirmation of principle. Each case is other. Each decision is different and requires an absolutely unique interpretation, which no existing coded rule can or ought to guarantee absolutely. In the little time that I have left, and I've got no time left, getting near the end, leads to the question of the structure of conscience to be undecidable by turning to discernment and the function of deprehending oneself in a moral decision. I will follow some of the analysis of the way the word deprehends functions in Donne's sermons by following, to some extent, Gary Kucher's excellent essay, Ecstatic Donne, Conscience, Sin, Surprise in the Sermons, and in the Mitchell letters. But from a Derridian perspective, the structure of conscience for Derrida is having within me a witness that others can't see, and who is therefore at the same time other than me and more intimate me than myself. So like an allergy, he's already there. I just have to build up tolerance. Having the other within me that is more intimate with me than myself is an event, because I am encountering a secret within me precisely because it is another. The encounter with the other is therefore a surprise that my conscience cannot anticipate. For as Donne says, quote, and this is from the sermon, God hears in the very first motions of a man's heart, which that man, till he proceed to a further consideration, doth not hear, nor feel, nor deprehend in himself. Kucher supplies another example of the explicit association of deprehension with surprise. Quote, if ye neither sleep nor wake, neither forbear nor resist, yet how often you may surprise and deprehend a man when you think directly to look upon such an object. And if you ask him the quality and color of it, he will tell you he saw it not. So right before your eyes, you still can't say anything about it. In deprehension, we overcome our allergy to ourselves and become other to ourselves. As we have already discussed, God is the name of the other within me, and any moral decision I make is an event, because it dispossesses me of myself and my ability to control and master a situation. Kucher gives an extensive, detailed study of the ways conscience is experienced as an uncanny, daimonic otherness, and alarmingly alien to us as volitional agents. However, since deprehension is a modality of surprise, as Derrida states, it's worth recalling that an event implies surprise, exposure, the unanticipatable. Quote, a decision should tear. That's what the word decision means. It means cut. It should disrupt the fabric of the possible. Whenever I say my decision or I decide, you can be sure that I'm mistaken. The decision should always be, and I know that this is a proposition seems unacceptable according to traditional logic, the decision should always be the other's decision. My decision is, in fact, the other's decision. This does not exempt or exonerate me from responsibility. My decision can never be mine. It's always the other's decision in me, in a way that I am passive in the decision-making. For my decision to be an event, for it to disrupt my power, my ability, my possibility, for it to disrupt the normal course of history, I must undergo my decision, which is evidently logically unacceptable. I'd like, therefore, to develop the idea of decision as always the other's decision, because I'm responsible for the other, and it's for the other that I decide. It is the other who decides in me without in any way exonerating me from my responsibility. If the decision is always another's decision, end of quote, is always another's decision because I'm responsible for the other and it's the other that decides, then what happens when Donne says I deprehend myself? Donne writes a sermon on Mark 16 that he believeth, and I quote, he that believeth not shall be damned. And there are moments in every Christian's life when belief is difficult. So Donne provides a narrative of the dark night of the soul. Quote, I lock my door to myself. I throw myself down in the presence of God. I divest myself of all worldly thoughts and bend all my powers and faculties to God. And suddenly, I find myself scattered, melted, fallen into vain thoughts, into no thoughts. I am upon my knees and talk and think nothing. I deprehend myself in it and go about to mend it. I gather new forces, new purposes, and try again, do better. Only after the penitent person says, I deprehend myself, does he find that he can gather new forces, new purposes to try again, after suddenly finding himself scattered and melted, fallen into vain thoughts. Christian readers would recognize the dying to the self, such as in Mark 8:3-5, for whosoever shall save his life shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, and the same shall save it. The penitent, nevertheless, still speaks of the presence of God, and so there is an other within the deepest regions of myself. The suddenness of his decline suggests a moment of surprise, but the real mystery or question is, what does it mean when he surprises himself? To return to an earlier diagnosis of the autoimmune subject by Derrida, it appears more likely Donne is deconstructing the self-mastery of the subject, the I can of my own freedom. In terms of the decision, Derrida makes it clear in the Politics of Friendship that the decision, quote, must surprise, in a word, the very subjectivity of the subject, which is to kill it. In other words, Derrida is saying the subject does not exist except when it invents itself with each and every decision. I will conclude by saying how Derrida demonstrates that the gift of death affects the undecidable moral decisions that our conscience faces every day. Derrida first establishes that the risk of sacrifice is unavoidable. If every other is wholly other, then every other is, Derrida states, like God, the wholly other. That is to say, the axiom states that we are infinitely other, like God, because uniquely singular in our infinite finitude. We are always dying and always trying to get over that hump, right? That finite limit. We are always becoming other to ourselves. Yet the axiom in its almost tautological form means that every other is like everybody else, since we are all equally alike in our singularity. So the axiom places us well within the undecidable, forcing us with the choice to treat every single other the same as everyone else, upholding their equality, or treating every single person as unique, quite different. Singularity, or Derrida answers to the problem that takes us to the conceptual limit, and he writes, paradox, scandal, aporia are themselves nothing else than sacrifice. The revelation of the conceptual thinking of its limit, its death and finitude. And as soon as I enter a relation with the other, with the gaze, the look, request, command, or call of the other, I know that I can respond only by sacrificing ethics, all the ethical rules. That is, by sacrificing whatever obliges me to also respond in the same way, in the same instant to all others. I offer the gift of death. I betray. I don't need to raise my knife over my son in Mount Moriah for that. And I have to get this in because this is the one about the cat, my favorite line of the whole book. Derrida captures the ethical magnitude of the sacrifice I make in every decision in relation to the singular other by calling it a hyper-ethical sacrifice and unjustifiable as the infinite sacrifice I make at each moment. Derrida asks, and I quote, how could you justify the fact that you sacrifice all the cats in the world to the cat you feed at home every morning for years, whereas other cats in the world die of hunger at every instant, not to mention people? Derrida compares this infinite sacrifice, which haunts every decision, to original sin because it is originary with every decision. I am guilty inasmuch as I'm responsible. This guilt comes about because the undecidable remains caught, lodged as a ghost, at least, but an essential ghost in every decision. And I'll stop there. Questions for Garry? Yes, Michelle.
I Everyone here as well. Thank you very much for a really stimulating lecture. It was so interesting, and I've been writing like mad here. It's really great. Thank you. I enjoyed it so much. And I was especially struck by your comment, which, I knew this about Biathanatos, that Donne had asked that it not be published. And what I didn't know is that he also said not to burn it.
That's right.
And what I would like to add to that, I'm sure you know this, but is that specifically he told his son or sons not to publish it. And I wonder if this could be viewed as an example of autoimmunity in the sense that he's being destroyed, or his reputation, if this is why he didn't want it to be published, he is being destroyed from kind of within his own house, right? That is, that his sons are the ones that published it. And yet, it furthermore comes from the self, because he, by insisting that it not be burned, made it possible for this to not happen. So does that work as an instance of autoimmunity?
Dead on. Only it's even more complicated than that, because he said, and you're implying, he said, don't burn, because, as it turned out, his son did publish it in 1642. But what Derrida is saying, and what Donne is doing, is he's delegating his death. He's delegating his death to his son, which is to say, I'm dying, and I don't want to die. So could you, when I'm gone? Do you see, death is, we can only resist death, and we can only take responsibility by accepting our own death. Oh boy, I'm going in now. Should I stay? Can you still hear me? Was I going too close? Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. No, I think I'm good. Okay.
Bit of a learning curve.
Because I go back into it. So in other words, it's Derrida calls it exappropriation. We want to gain control over our death. We want to live forever, blah, blah, blah. But we have to delegate our life to dead things, like prostheses, technology, like this one. I'm extending my life and ruining yours. So you guys really like that one. So yes, that paradox that we wanted it kept, but not while he was alive. I think that he had talks with his family saying, it's really good. I like this book. So publish it after I'm gone.
He said no. That's my whole point. He said, don't publish it, even once I'm gone.
Well, if I may, he said there's two Donne. There's Jack Donne and then there's Dr. Donne. He said Jack Donne has no problem with you publishing it, but as a minister of the church, as the dean in a church, he's saying, please don't publish it during my lifetime because I'll go to jail. He knew that he would get into all manner of trouble. He got in trouble because he married, the guy who wrote Utopia, he married his niece and was promptly thrown in prison for doing it because she was left by 15, I think. So he's a bit of a troublemaker. And so, he knew what kind of trouble that he was in if that book got published, because it's blasphemous to many. And the only clear example of suicide in the whole book is Jesus, who says, I lay down my life for my sheep. He just says, I'm going to kill myself. All the other examples are ambiguous and unclear. But he says, we have a natural desire for death. So he says, we have a death wish. And he certainly did. That scholars don't like it. They get upset when they talk about it. They fight amongst themselves. But that's what keeps our heart pumping a little harder. We need exercise for a second.
Yes, thank you so much, Garry, for this wonderful talk. There's a lot to unpack there, obviously, and predictably enough, I want to ask you about Derrida. So bear with me just with the unpacking. It relates to the two names you mentioned very briefly, but I think are really crucial to understanding what's going on. Specifically to understanding Derrida's very uneasy relation to Judeo-Christianity and to the hyphen, specifically the hyphen, all the tensions and frictions between this combined term. So the two names on the one hand, Emmanuel Levinas, on the other hand, St. Augustine. right? These are the two models, as it were. These names can stand for the two models of the construction of the subject from a Christian perspective in the case of Augustine, from a Judaic perspective in the case of Levinas. And they have to do with two different relations to exteriority, the exteriority of the divine in particular. So for Augustine, God observes me from within before I even know it, as you beautifully put it, right? And this act of observation, as is clear in the Confessions of Augustine, is what creates subjectivity. The subject is created by that exteriority of God observing and making visible in secret that entire inner sphere of the subject, right? So the exterior within. In the case of Levinas, who is kind of channeling the entire Jewish tradition, the exteriority of God is outside, but it's also invested in every single other who is wholly other. There are different, obviously, translations of this. And so the exterior remains exterior, and in my infinite responsibility, I am trying to approach that as much as possible without ever getting there. And I receive my own subjectivity as an I from that relation to the exterior other, who will necessarily remain exterior, because if it's within me, then I will have kind of done away with that transcendence of the other.
Yeah.
So we have two different relations to the exteriority of God, even though in both cases they shape who I am. Right? So the question is, and this is where we get, I think, really to the question of suicide, right? In suicide, and in this act of becoming an object to myself in order to kill myself, I have to become other to myself. I have to be self-exteriorized. So wouldn't you agree that, first of all, my two questions are, wouldn't the Derridian paradox be that in suicide I become exterior to myself, but I also cut myself off from exteriority by putting an end to that division, by making myself into a pure object, forms, basically.
Right.
So this would be the Derridian kind of paradox of suicide. I become other to myself. I take away my otherness at the same time, right? So this cutting off from exteriority by acknowledging, and so that's my question. Would this be the Derridian? And the other question with regard to ecocide, the other half of our conference. This exteriority is obviously not only psychic and not only theological, it's the exteriority of the life world that is outside of me but also within me. It's breathable air, it's nourishment, and so on. So how would you relate this this paradoxical operatic relation to exteriority in suicide to ecocide as a cutting off, an acknowledgement and a cutting off from the exteriority of the life world?
I love what you did, and I like the interiority opposition, but I would argue, let me disagree just a little bit, that the prophets interiorized the presence of God in the heart of this world, and that they were to seek justice, which is the conscience in the theology of the conscience. So the exteriorization is certainly present, but I think by the time you get to the later prophets, it is, at least in my reading, they are so Christian. You can see that Christian, I mean, I don't mean that in the sense that they came first. Christianity is deeply embedded in prophets like Jeremiah. So it is so profoundly important to see that the movement of revelation of the light of God is in the interior. Christians really double down on God illuminates the interior of our subjectivity so that we can decide for ourselves, and we're made in His image. So, in my opinion, dare I say it, there is an articulus in the prophets between what we call Old Testament. I won't say Torah because that's different, but the prophets definitely set up the Christian text. So the interiority-exteriority opposition, in my opinion, is unsustainable. It's at least in my reading.
And just to specify, I don't posit it as an opposition. There are two ways in which exteriority shapes interiority and actually makes interiority what it is. By indwelling interiority in the case of St. Augustine, and by shaping it from the outside, but in such a way that I am not myself without that shaping of the exteriority from the outside.
Okay.
So it's the place of exteriority as constitutive of what is interior, whether that exteriority is within the subject's interiority
Yeah.
or whether it's outside. It's still constitutive of shaping. It's still
Still exterior.
It's still exterior.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, but it still shapes who I am.
I agree
from these
that-
different positions.
Yeah, I think I quite grasp that. So in other words, and now I talk about the face of the other, and that's exterior. It's even like God. It's so high in a vertical way that it's the most high. It's incomprehensible to us, and so we are a hostage to the other. And so he didn't want any connection to the other. The other was absolute, like God. So other people were manifestations of God's absolute otherness, and so it maintains an exteriority. Derrida deconstructed that in Violence and Metaphysics and said, well, if I didn't have any relation to the other, it would just pass over me, I would never see it. I would never experience it. So I have to have a sameness with the other. There has to be some connection. If aliens come down and we can't see or hear them, not going to bother us much, right? So, in my opinion, exteriority is definitely the issue because the other is the exteriority. So I think I get that that's what you're driving at. The Judeo-Christian Derrida was, of course, a Jew who hid his Judaism in his Christianity, which I know you know, Michael. And so it's always surprising to me, and many scholars would try to interpret Derrida as being Jewish. And by the way, he was accused of being a Nazi by many scholars when he was not known to be Jewish. So he had to start, in my opinion, coming out as a Jew, at least had a Jewish family. And he does wear his talith quite often. But I think that's a fascinating debate. And all I can say is Christianity, there's Northern Fry said that the New Testament is a mosaic of quotations of the Old Testament. And so the fact that Christianity is different from Judaism is, to me, tomato tomato. It's very hard for me to argue that there's a difference. Okay, so that's my fault, I guess. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but in my opinion, the exteriority is in the relation to the other. What I would say, and I'm going to go back to the immune system again, because this is something I really didn't want to put in paper, because I thought it was stretching it. But I'm seeing more and more now that allergic responses show that we are never ourselves. We are always defined in relation to the other. So if I can follow what your question was driving at, there's always an exteriority. I am never not beyond or transcend that relation with the exteriority. So every physical environment, this is spiritual, but it's also physical. Every time I switch it into a new room, go down the hall, I could be exposing myself to some other substance that's toxic to me, but no one else. I have nephews that are allergic to cold air. Never in my life would I have ever anticipated that a human being could be allergic to cold air. So the environments that we go through, and I think I'm agreeing with you wholeheartedly, shape who we are. But we are also adapting to those environments. And so we have to be autoimmune. We have to expose ourselves to the other. That's why we have vaccines, and I urge you to get vaccinated, because that's how you adapt to the new virus that's coming down the street. They mutate, so we have to mutate. The old model of immunity and allergy was that we were in a fixed frame, allergies came in, and we had to adapt to a new fixed chain. fixed frame. But no, they're now saying continuity, your immune system is always ready to shift itself into a new form of itself. It's always altered reactivity, is the term. When you're using medical discourse, I really find it difficult for me to accept medical discourse. But it's really crucial for autoimmunity because we use our limits to our maximum benefit and we add prostheses or we delegate our death to others. We literally pass ourselves on through our legacy in many obvious ways, but sometimes not so obvious ways. I can transfer my mental illness or mental struggles to my grandchildren without even knowing them. You see what I mean? That through the psychological unconscious troubles that I have can manifest in my offspring, and they'll survive it and pass it on to the children, and then we'll come back and not as a physiological disorder, but as a psychological disorder. So in other words, the allergy metaphor, and it's not just a metaphor, as the psychological relation to the other is going to be in the body and in the mind, and that's who we are. That's where we start. So the articulus is the relation between us. There's self and other, but the relation is what determines who we are. So you understand?
So I have something much less substantial probably to say than that. But when we were talking about kind of our relation to the other and things unknowable, when speaking about responsibility, we're using it a lot. But what kind of came up in my mind is something that Deleuze said in a seminar about painting, where we're in the act of painting, we can kind of rebels against the eye. It's a manual function. He doesn't say autonomous, but that's kind of how I use it, where the hand is autonomous from the eye to create the painting that comes into the whole chaos of packaging things like that. But do you think that kind of along the same lines as what you're saying?
I would say yes, because it's like surrealism, and there are other movements in art where you've got to let the unconscious speak. And many painters would just throw things at the canvas and to see what would came of it, because it's the unknown. In other words, what we're calling the unconscious, and I don't know if this will make Michael happy or unhappy, which is the unconscious is just a form of secrecy. When I do the 16th century, I was trying not to use Freud, because some traditionalists don't like me to use anachronistic references to Freud. Well, they didn't talk about the unconscious. I said, no, it's the other way around. Freud got his theory of the unconscious from the old guys that came before him. And the way they talked about it, the reason I quoted those issues, the deeper end, which is a weird word, but it hit the nail on the head, is because you don't know what the hell you're doing half the time. So he said, and this is done in an era that would be very upset about him talking like this. You know, when I pray, I don't know what the hell I pray. And that is shocking. They would say it's a secret. Well, the secret is just another way of saying, there's a part of me that I can't control. No. They also talk about God being there, but Derrida makes it clear. God is simply the structure. We call God the structure of the fact that I don't have total control over who I am. So, in a good way, that's God. In a bad way, it's the devil, right? So, but you see, that's the autoimmune limit. I have to let that other in. I'm not going to be adaptable. If you try to do the same thing over and over again, you know, that's what madness is, right? You're not going to get the results you're looking for by simply repeating. That's what trauma is. Trauma is repeating without any control. You want some control, so you go to therapy and you do the work of the repetition to get some control back, but they'll never be total. Well, I don't know if that answers the question. I'll be very interesting. Okay?
Yeah, no, I like what you think, because Maurice Bonneau says that we can never choose death, because we can aim at it, but of course we can't experience death because we're dead. So we can only kind of feel in the direction of death. So that, you know, of course undermines the kind of idea of asserting one's mastery through suicide. But I wonder, does that also overlap with this idea of death prevention, this idea of Is it a sort of surprise?
Absolutely.
Although you can't be surprised because you're dead, but I don't know.
Well, okay, if I may just, that was an excellent example, because Blanchot is saying that, and if you've ever read anything Blanchot, especially his creative writing, it is absolutely frustrating and baffling. I thought I was going to go crazy. So anyhow, what Blanchot was saying is, let's say you think you're going to die, and I have to drop dead right here, so please don't leave me here. Drag me out, at least to my car. When I go down, and I played hockey, and one day I was at a game, and a guy, I looked up at the clock, there was about 20 seconds left, and I had the puck, and I said, I'll just, as we say in hockey, brag the puck, I'll just skate away. And some guy took a stick and just went like that, right against my face. Bang! And I remember going down like this, with blood flying everywhere, and I saw friends of mine in the stands who knew me, they were going, it was literally a slow-mo scene, and I thought, as I'm going down, am I going to get back up again? Is this it? You don't know when you're dying. So that's why it's never in your control. And you're in so much pain, like you are right now. You might be dying right now, and you don't know what, or well, a colleague of mine had a heart attack. There happened to be a woman in the room. It wasn't just a woman, she was in good shape. And she kept doing the CPR on him, the old one, where he went like this, and kept him alive for like 8 minutes. And the ambulance came and they put him in suspension, and he's alive. He was gone, but for her. So death is an indeterminate boundary. It's other to you. And you're absolutely right, you have no control over when you're going to die. As Woody Allen said, I don't fear death, I just don't want to be there when it happens. And as it turns out, he won't. Thank you, great question.
Well, thank you, Garry Sherbert, and of course, Mike Martyr, who was our first lecturer.